Éirí amach 1960, achtra a dathróig éire go deo. Is a mala clia is mó a Horlan trid. Cork fórógra an fírsig, an trid agus na híbertí fola, síirse contosig I bolatíocht na héireann a ríis. Bhí scéal féin ag Corcaigh maidir le 1960. Frostachas dímá agus tep a bhí ann, ach bhí tionachar mór aige ar poblachtáin an cúntaí sna mblianta dár gcionn áfach. Seo scéal éirí amach Corcaigh. Tháinig Owen McNeill go Corcaigh sa bhliain 1930, le labhairt ag cruinniú I Hallan na Gcathrach, a raibh sé mar aimige cór Corcaigh den na hóglaigh a bhanú.
And that night the hall was packed. It was full to capacity, over 1,000 people in attendance that represented all shades of nationalist opinion.
When the Irish Volunteers were formed in 1913, they had no express party political aim per se. They were not linked to the cause of Home Rule because, of course, the IRB, which was behind the formation of volunteers, did not support Home Rule, but neither were they geared expressly towards the achievement of a republic because, of course, that would have been rather unpopular. More generally, they were given a role of simply training Ireland's youth.
Dathraigh cuasaí an cruinnithe go tobisteach nuair a bhí míthuiscin sa lucht éisteachta faoi mar a rinne McNeill chur síos ar óglaigh alla.
Basically, he was saying that the Ulster Volunteers set an example of how Irishmen can dictate their own destiny. But this wasn't going down too well with some of the people in the audience who felt that he was actually praising, say, partition or something like that, and they were getting very agitated, and a few started shouting and telling him to sit down. But McNeill remained completely oblivious to all this, and he finished up his speech by standing up and issuing a rallying cry. Well, he stood up, basically raised his arms in the air and said Ulster had led the way and Cork had followed, and 3 cheers for the Ulster Volunteers, and pandemonium followed.
Thosig trid mór sa hala agus rinne rúthar ar an ordáin. Níor stad an trid go dtí gur gléich daoine amach go raibh na Pólíní an sin agus scapan slua.
Order was restored, the meeting resumed, Casement spoke, and it was proposed and adopted and agreed that a Cork Corps of Irish Volunteers would form. And that night, application forms were given out and over 500 men enlisted.
Nuair a bhanaíodh iad, bhí ord vast ar na hóglaigh, ach gan bhail bhí deachracht mór acu. Léiríodh cólag agus a bhí an taontas idir na Canarí nuair a bhris an cogadh amach san Eorp is saorann na mbliain 1940.
John Redmond initially stood up on the eve of Britain's declaration of war and said the British government could count on the Irish Volunteers to defend Ireland alongside the Ulster Volunteers.
Geall an bhratan rialtas dúchas de éireann, cé go churach siar go dtí tar éis an cogadh. Mar luach séthar, spraig Redmond na hóglaigh dul isteach in arm na bhreatanna.
Home Rule went on the statute books on the 18th of September, and 2 days later, at a speech in Woodbridge in County Wicklow, Redmond called upon the volunteer movement, in effect, to take part in the war.
The majority of Corkmen who would have been in the volunteers throughout the county and the city seemed to have sided with the National Volunteers and supported Redmond's belief that, serve the British Empire and hopefully push on towards Home Rule.
Ach, ní a bhéin seans go méid an tír pórtach I gogad hasanna. Dorló siúd a raibh na tuairimí ba láidre acu I meas na hóglach.
They more or less told Redmond they were having none of it. Redmond persisted with his call, and the movement split. The figures are disputed, but approximately 170,000 supported John Redmond, and it varies between 7,000 and 11,000 of the more separatist Republican-minded volunteers refused to follow John Redmond. Redmond supporters were backed by the establishment, political, military and civil, and they became known as the Irish National Volunteers, while the more separatist-minded volunteers such as Owen MacNeill, Padraig Pearse, Tomás McCurtain and Terence McSweeney here in Cork retained the title of Irish Volunteers or Óglaigh na hÉireann.
Bionlach beag about Óglaigh na hÉireann, ach de réir mar a bhí daoine ag dul in aghaidh an cogadh san Eorp, laigh an tachiíocht de Redmond agus den cogadh.
Well, in the spring of 1915, there was no guarantee that the war was going to end anytime soon, or more particularly, that the island and the United Kingdom was going to be on the winning side. So those who stood against the war experienced an upsurge in membership at this time.
Tugad deis den na Óglaigh a náirta léirú go poblí ag socrad an iníon cáúil Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa sa bhliain 1915.
If one has a look at the organising committee for the funeral, every single person who has a major role to play in 1915 is on that committee. All 7 signatories, 2 other of those who were executed, all of Cumann na Mon's executive, a significant proportion of of those who played a part in the lockout of 1913. From the volunteers' perspective, this is the last occasion on which the Irish Volunteers and the National Volunteers parade together, and it's also the first occasion on which the Irish Citizen Army and the Irish Volunteers collaborate on a venture, and of course the next time in any significant way was going to be the 1916 Rising itself.
Bhí léirsithe poblí a Gorcaigh a léirigh gan áras go raibh na Óglaigh beo agus láidir.
And another occasion was the 1916 St. Patrick's Day parade in Cork. McCurtain issued an order that all the volunteers in the city would congregate and that they would take part in the parade. I'm not fully sure how many numbers were parading in it, but for anyone watching it, it would have been a definite signal that the Irish Volunteers haven't gone away.
By the end of 1916, over 40 new volunteer companies had been organised. A programme of training was underway, manuals were being written, new manifestos were issued, and like I said, the organisation by the end of 1915 was really up and running again.
Galua sa bhliain 1916, bhí pleanáil rúnda an IRB den éirí amach siúl go maith agus bhí buint mór ag Corcaigh leis.
Here in Cork, the main task was to mobilise on Easter Sunday, which was the day originally planned for the rising, march down to Macroom, concentrate in the area of Macroom, where they would get their share of the weapons that the Germans were bringing ashore in Kerry. And again, like I said, once they got those weapons, they would arm their men, leave obviously a security party here in Cork, and advance then on Dublin along with the others. And the expectation was that hopefully that the National Volunteers would rise up in support, and indeed that the people of Ireland would rise up in support. A very bold plan. Militarily, did it have much chances of success? To be quite frank with you, it's hard to say. By 1916, the British Army was in its 2nd year of the First World War. Britain was fighting for its survival at that stage. They were losing thousands of men. They had lost thousands of men on the Western Front and at Gallipoli, and I think it was clear that they weren't going to entertain any new flank being opened here in Ireland.
Cúig na planana seachrán áfach, nuair a gabh na Sasanig long na haram a dagrig casement amach ó chósta chiarí. Ach níor chur cailút na haram isteach flanana Óglaigh Chorcaí.
It certainly would have hindered the operation, but as was the case in Dublin, for example, even though they'd had a small contingent of rifles landed as Hoth, a very large number of volunteers still had to provide their own rifles. So the shortage of weapons wasn't the major factor, it was the confusion of orders coming from above.
In that week, in the week leading up to the Easter Rising, there was 11 conflicting and countermanding orders issued from the volunteer headquarters in Dublin. The military council were choreographing this thing very, very carefully. They even kept the chief of staff, Owen MacNeill, out of the loop. As it turned out, MacNeill heard about it on Holy Thursday, the night of Holy Thursday, and he issued a countermanding order. Then Pearse spoke to him on the Friday and another order was issued. So like I said, there was a whole series of conflicting and countermanding orders that put McCurtain and McSweeney in an impossible position as military commanders. The one thing that is essential to the success of any military operation is a clear chain of command. And in this occasion, the volunteers didn't have that. In actual fact, what was happening, they were operating under two parallel chains of command. On one hand, you had the official volunteer chain of command, and on the other hand, you had the Irish Republican Brotherhood chain of command. And that, as it turned out, would lead to huge confusion.
Ní a bhís ag ceansaí na Burgóide, Thomas McCurtain, agus a las ceanara, Terence McSweeney, cad go díreach a bhí ag torlúnt, agus thochraigh siad a cuid a haring siar trónóna dána cásca. I ré seachtain na cásca, heas ceannarí na hóglach a bhí istigh ina gceann catharú I shráid siars in aig arm na bhreatanna a bhí timpeall orthu.
It would be hard to gauge the atmosphere in the volunteer hall because, like I said, the worst possible thing you could do with any soldier is to deprive him of information. And these people wouldn't have had solid intelligence emanating from Dublin.
We have some testimonies as to the atmosphere within the hall. It was simply confused. I mean, McCurtain and McSweeney, of course, had to explain to their subordinates why they were in the position that they were in. The subordinates who, of course, hadn't known that this was supposed to be a fight, now faced the very real prospect of arrest, imprisonment, and who knows, as far as they were concerned, possible execution for engaging in armed action against the Crown or treason, without themselves having had the opportunity to fire a shot. So it was a very, very difficult situation for McCurtain in particular, and McSweeney, his second in command.
Another key element of the volunteer plan in Dublin, and indeed throughout the country, was the element of surprise. The volunteers managed to use that in Dublin, where they captured the GPO in other locations throughout the city. But by Easter Monday night, here in Cork and in the rest of the country, the element of surprise had been lost. If the volunteers rose up here in Cork, they would have found the British Army ready and willing to take them on.
Ní raibh óglaigh Chorcaí in ann tada a dhéanamh I gcoinne fórsaí na bhreatanna. Bhí Chorcaí Gháin a bhí miáte a bheith pórtach sa trid, agus bhain sé clú agus cáil amach as a cuid iarachtaí dul go ballá clia.
Michael O'Quill, he was determined that he would take part in the rising, and he wasn't prepared to wait for any orders, so he decided to strike off on his own. One way or another, he was going to see action. He became known in Cork folklore as the man who walked to Dublin. He was the one volunteer here in Cork who was, say, done more than just talk about fighting. He actually tried his best to take part in it.
Ará sé gurcaig, nuair a bhí an éirí amach I mallá clíthe curtha faoi cois, tharla idirbheartaíocht idir fórsaí na bhreatanna agus ceannarí na hóglach.
The then Lord Mayor Ardvera, Butterfield and the then Bishop Cohan really came to the fore because they went and began to mediate between the Crown forces as they were and the Irish Volunteer commanders.
The outcome of the crisis in Cork was the best of a bad job from the perspective of McCurtain and Sweeney. The deal that they thought they had brokered with the British government involving the good offices of the Bishop of Cork would have meant that their men would have been, and they themselves would have gone into captivity, but the weapons would have remained intact, possibly to be used another day. That it would be peace with honour, as it were. But of course, that peace deal unravelled almost as soon as the men were in the clutches of the British.
De bhór comhúr agus a bhí an éirí amach I mallá clia, ceap an General Maxwell nach raibh pórtachs na córátaí a gurcaig, go raibh na termí a rinne le McCurtain rómhog.
When Maxwell and the British authorities in Dublin Castle, and indeed the British government, got to hear of this, they decided on a different course of action. Orders were given to, like I said, take all the weapons into custody, arrest and intern all the leading volunteers. Now, from the British perspective, these guys were guilty of treason. The British were fighting a war for existence on the Western Front against the German Empire. They couldn't afford to have any similar incidences erupt here in Ireland. If the British knew where there were weapons, right, despite the good faith that might have been displayed here in Cork, they couldn't leave the weapons there where the volunteers can get their hands on them again. So from that perspective, it's quite understandable why the British military leadership took the action they did in rounding up the volunteers and indeed confiscating the weapons, despite the good faith. And I do believe there was good faith shown here in Cork City by the British authorities in Victoria Barracks.
Gan bhfuil, bhalig fórsaín bhreatanna public dánig a raibh aithne acu orthu. Thug sin iad chuig Barnard House, áit cónathe Thomas Kent I Gorcaig.
In many respects, Cork had great leaders, not just in the city here, but in the county. I mean, you take the Kent brothers in particular, and the Kent family, very strong Republicans, and very hard-working people.
You had 4 Kent brothers there at the time: Thomas, Richard, David and William. The Kents came from, we'll say, a very nationalist background. The brothers had been very much involved in the Land League, the Land War, the agitation for tenants' rights and all the rest of it. They were very nationalist-minded. They were Gaelic speakers. They had a great belief in an independent Ireland. They were founders of the volunteer organisation in North Cork. And indeed, by 1916, Thomas Kent was the commandant of the Galtee battalion of the Irish Volunteers.
Bhris cá fuilteach amach, rud a léirigh cad a éitigh torlú ach a bheith I bhfad níos measa, ach gur tháinig na hóglaigh agus údarás na bhreatanna cóin tú faoi cnílacha síochána.
Head Constable William Rowe, who lived here in Cork City above in St. Luke's, he was a married man with 5 children. He knocked at the door and read out the warrant, the arrest warrant, and called upon the Kents to come out. And he was answered by one of the Kents shouting out, "We won't come out, we won't surrender, we'll fight to the end." They fired from the doorway, and Head Constable Rowe was hit in the head with a shotgun blast, and he was killed. And quite a heavy gun battle erupted then.
Leis an arm lón beagnach caite agus arm na bhreatanna tagtha chun cabhrú leis an RIC geall na Kents sa deireadh.
After they were taken out of the house and were being disarmed, Richard Kent, who was a well-known athlete, decided to make a run for it. So he jumped over the ditch and he was shot and killed. During the gun battle, David had been wounded. I think 2 of his fingers were blown off and he was wounded in the side. But all the Kents, and indeed their 80-year-old mother who was there, were taken into custody.
Suchriach cad a bhí anán the Thomas Kent I gcuairt arm I Merrick, Victoria. Furas ceantach é agus ghairach an báis é.
He was charged with not the murder of Constable Rowe, interestingly enough, but the charge was waging war against His Majesty the King, which amounted to treason. At the appointed time, Thomas Kent would have been led from his cell, accompanied by the priest. He would have been placed up against a wall that probably would have had a row of sandbags behind to stop ricochets. The officer in charge of the firing squad would have brought his men to attention and given the orders: ready, aim, fire. And a volley of shots would have rang out that would have ended the life of Thomas Kent.
Maríoch na Drothracha Kent ag deireadh an éirí amach, ach bhí corcaíoch eile a fuair bás sa trid I Mala Clia.
Sean Hurley was born in Drina, County Cork. He was the only Cork man killed during the fighting in 1916 in Dublin. He was shot at the forecourts. Sean had the distinction of being the only Cork man to have died during the 1916 rising, when there would have been so many more sitting in Shear Street in Cork who would have loved to have been given the opportunity to fight in Dublin that same week.
Nuair a ectar na planana a bhí a bhaim, ní féidir rá ach gur hep éirí amach Corcaig, ach an éitigh Thomas McCurtain aon rud eile a dhéanamh.
I think McCurtain and McSweeney were very smart. I think they realised that today was not the day that they could fight. If they did, that they would lose and lose badly.
There were 2 courts of inquiry into the actions of Thomas McCurtain, one convened by the volunteer leadership and one convened by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, to examine McCurtain, the action taken by McCurtain during Easter week and the decisions he made. And both courts of inquiry exonerated him. They appreciated and accepted that under the circumstances, Thomas McCurtain could do no other thing than what he actually did.
McCurtain had no choice whatsoever but to do what he did, to proceed with a military venture when the lives of your men are in your hands, when one doesn't have very clear express orders, would be to act counter to military discipline.
From a Cork perspective, the leadership structure was still intact. The rising didn't happen in Cork to the extent of, we say, Dublin and other parts of the country. But that was significant in many respects because when we go and we lead into the War of Independence, you'll see how structured that leadership was.
In the letters that McCurtain wrote from prison, he wrote home and wrote to his friends and family, you could see that he agonised night after night alone in his prison cell if he made the right decision.
Chuir sé isteach an irid céine Terence McSweeney agus dan sé leis go dtí a bhás sa bhliain 1940.
In the last days of his hunger strike, as his life was ebbing away from him, as he was getting weaker and weaker, his thoughts remained on Easter 1916 here in Cork. And one of the last letters he wrote to Cathal Brugha, who was Minister of Defence at the time, he said, the words went, "Ah, Cathal, the pain of Easter is dead at last."
Certainly in the McCurtain and McSweeney's a psychological level, as it were, the memory of their humiliation in Easter week of 1916 must have acted as a spur to them to really engage once they had been released from their times in prison. Of course, the deaths of both men in turn heighten and increase that level of activism. The fact that McCurtain is shot dead by the police, the fact that McSweeney dies at the end of a torturous hunger strike, elevate both men. They become in turn icons of the struggle in Cork, and the memory of, as it were, both the humiliation is rapidly overturned by the memory of pride in both of these two standout figures and the other volunteers who fought and died during the campaign. So whatever failings that occurred during Easter week in 1916 are very, very rapidly forgotten.
Cé gur hep éirí amach, bheadh tionachar mór ag sin Corcaig san blianta dorgion.
The failure of 1916 and the subsequent imprisonment of many of Cork volunteers in Fronguk, I think, necessitated a development of a new type of revolutionary kind of movement, thought, practice. Collins, McCurtain and McSweeney were all imprisoned in Fronguk, and I think being there they would have discussed and realised that the techniques that they'd used during the 1916 Rising would not work in future. They couldn't take on the British Army in a pitched battle one-on-one. They needed to develop new methods, and one of those would be famously guerrilla warfare.
While we didn't have the mass numbers to take on the Crown forces as it was in those days, we had enough to actually dint their armour and to really contain them within space. I mean, we've seen that in Cork when the troops would come out from Cork City to various parts. They were isolated, they were vulnerable, and Tom Barry and others used it to the most effective way possible. Sadly for Collins, as we know, he was caught in exactly one of those said tactics.
Mar glach óglaigh Chorcaí Port san éirí amach sa bhliain 1916, darla mórán daoine go raibh buint mór aige sin leis an Port le a bhí ag an gúnta I gcogadh na Saoirse.
They didn't fight in 1916, but they more than made up for it when the War of Independence broke out in January 1919.
I don't think there's any doubt that there is a connection between the inaction or the perceived inaction of Cork and the fact that between the War of Independence 1919 to 21 it becomes the epicentre of, as it were, the military struggle against Britain.
Kilmichael, for example, Crossbarry, the deaths of Tomás McCurtain and Terence McSweeney, and the burning of Cork, all in 1920, which was a very traumatic year, I think would have has its roots in the 1916 and this belief that they wouldn't be found wanting again.
The fact that the volunteers in Cork didn't actually rise up and take part in the fight in Easter 1916, well, in my mind, there could be no doubt that it had a huge impact on their psyche and the way that they subsequently fought, the intensity of the fight against the Crown forces here in Cork, against the Royal Irish Constabulary, the British Army, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries.